The most cliche phrase in all game reviews is clunky controls. Whenever I read a review and it refers to the controls as clunky, that is a red flag for me for a number of reasons. The first reason is because clunkiness is often confused with a much more fundamental and important aspect of game design, which is limitation. And the irony is, whenever we discuss other forms of limitation in video games, like pixel art or chiptunes, there is an understanding, even among casual reviewers and fans, that limitation breeds creativity. And so even though technology has progressed beyond needing pixel art or needing chiptunes, there is still an appreciation and desire for this style of design because the limitation is part of its artistic composition. But funnily enough, when it comes to gameplay mechanics, this principle does not seem to exist or does not seem to extend towards the attitudes of a lot of players and reviewers. And there is this perception that gameplay mechanics are on this sort of linear path of evolution where back in the old days, in the bygone era, Capcom never considered the concept of having a fully controllable jump, even though they made Mega Man. They hadn't considered that as being possible. So in Ghosts and Goblins on the Super Nintendo, Arthur having this high commitment jump is just an aspect of old game design. And so now when Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection rolls around, the reason why it continues to have this limited jump isn't because there is an artistic merit or game design principle behind it, but rather because it's this throwback nostalgia to old boomers who want to play the game like they did on the Super Nintendo. But in my opinion, this is an attitude, whether implicit or explicit, that needs to be re-evaluated, because when you impose limitation on player mechanics, there is a lot that is gained in other aspects of the game design. And because most gameplay reviews and most people discussing games these days are so focused on the player mechanics, they never see the trade-off of what limitation in player mechanics can create. There's this sort of idea that in modern action games or platformer action games, whatever you'd call Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, the best, most well-designed form of gameplay design is to give the player all of these different mechanics. So the player can run, the player can jump, the player can fully control the jump, the player can double jump, the player can air dash, the player can parry, the parry has an iframe roll. Just all of the ideas and concepts you can throw at the player. That is a good thing, because the more options a player has, the more expression the player has. You've heard this all the time, player expression. But the idea that a lot of players and reviewers don't understand is that expression needs more than options. It also needs limitations. If you do not have limitations, you do not have that risk reward. You do not have a reason to have a choice. Think about this in terms of fighting games. There are examples of characters in fighting games that have overwhelming options and no limitations, like Akuma in Super Street Fighter 2, where there is no limitation on Akuma just corner locking you with fireballs, or even Chun-Li in Third Strike, where because every move Chun-Li does, or about every single move Chun-Li does, connects into Super, you would think, oh, look at all these different options Chun-Li players have. They can do a short into Super, they can do a medium kick into Super, they can do this into Super. But it turns out, ironically, because everything can connect to Super, that actually degrades the amount of player expression or player choice, whatever you want to call it, because the correct answer is always right in front of you. Do this into Super, do everything into Super. And so a lot of Chun-Li players in Third Strike all end up looking very similar to one another. This is something you can see in fighting games all the time. This also holds true with single player action games, where if you can do everything as the player, style distinctions start to go away. Ironically, we can see this in Devil May Cry 3, where if you have style switching modded in, where you can switch between all the different styles, you would think that would create more freedom and expression across the players. But it turns out, well, this creates this sort of universal, uniform style that everyone should play in, because using the best options of all the styles is smart. Versus if you look back to someone playing a distinctive gunslinger style, or someone playing a distinctive Royal Guard style or Swordmaster style, there is more tangible difference between playing the distinct, limited, locked-in styles And this also holds true with something like Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, where by having limitations on what the player can do, it creates a distinctive style of game design. Castlevania feels distinctive for a reason. Ghosts and Goblins feels distinctive for a reason. And another thing that a lot of people don't understand is that by taking away the options of the player, that can then open up opportunities for the enemy design and level design. Where if you look at Ghosts and Goblins levels on paper and you remove Arthur and swap in some other modern style platformer character action type of control system where you have 8-way shooting, you have double jumps, you have fully controllable jumps, you can parry, you can roll away, all of a sudden the difficulty of the game is completely removed. The game becomes super easy. A tangible example of this is Maria in Castlevania Rondo of Blood, where all the other characters have those limitations that are characteristic of Castlevania, but Maria doesn't, and so she can just cruise through the game without any difficulty at all. That would also hold true with Ghosts and Goblins, in that a lot of the game's difficulty is predicated on the limitations of the character and the movement. And it seems that a lot of players view this style of difficulty based off of player limitation, is either artificial or outdated, where in my opinion, it is actually the opposite. It is timeless and it is natural. This is where good difficulty comes from. Good difficulty is predicated off of limitations of the player and the player character, because this allows the player controlling the character the opportunity to offset these weaknesses. Again, think of this in fighting game terms. There's a reason why when people play low tiers and they do really well in tournament with low tiers, that is very exciting and that is a big expression of player skill, because the player is so skilled at the game that they are able to overcome the weaknesses of the character. Versus when you see a fighting game where maybe there is a character type that is just overpowered and can do everything and basically has no weaknesses, that does not allow the players of that character the same amount of opportunity to express their skill. So again, for a player to fully express his skill in a game, he needs both options to choose from, but also limitations on those options. You need the balance between the two, especially in single player games, because in single player games, game design is not just what the player can do, it's also what the enemy can do. And this is greatly demonstrated in Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection. What I really respect about this game is that the developer behind the game obviously knows this concept of player limitation and is constantly pushing on it in all these different ways. And ironically, a lot of negative reviews of this game or frustrated reviews of the game even recognize that Ghosts and Goblins is doing this. They'll even say, well, this damn level design, it knows how funky the jump arc is, and it just places things exactly wrongly to make the jump arc challenging. Or the enemy design, it knows exactly how limited the player movement and shot range is, and is constantly playing with that. That is good game design. That is what good difficulty looks like. It is difficulty that understands the natural limitations of the player, and then is constantly pushing on them. Can you overcome this? And a really funny example of this is the way Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection uses slopes constantly, because since you have this sort of 4-directional aiming and then you have that limited jump arc, slopes are like the ultimate enemy of Arthur. He has to constantly deal with these small variations of where he can move and where he can aim. And one thing that I really respect about this style of difficulty is, again, in a lot of modern action games, the style of difficulty that they go for is very incidental and technical, where you always have an option to get out of things. You always have like a roll or a parry or some way to get out of a bad choice. But in Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, you can't just always get out of your bad choices. You have to commit to your choices, and if they're the wrong choice, you will be punished for them. And what that creates is it creates a burden on the player to look ahead and see the game more holistically. And this is something that, again, older video games were better at exemplifying than modern video games, because modern video games are on this philosophy of just react, and if you react well enough, you can get out of this situation. Whereas Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, you have to know the nuances of things and a lot more depth than you do most other character action platformer games, whatever you'd want to call it. Because let's say you're going through a section with a lot of these burrito enemies throwing spears. You can't just understand, oh, the burrito enemy kind of flies linearly and he'll throw the spear and he'll come down. Because the burrito enemy will have these little slight variations of angle and slight variations where it will turn around and drop down and lift up. And in order to fully account for what these guys are up to and how to reliably get through these sections, you don't need to just know that they're flying linearly. You also kind of need to know where they turn around, what that trajectory looks like, how much they lift, how much you can squeeze under. Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection is one of the most spacing heavy games I have ever played that is not a shmup. You really need to know where your hitbox is, where are the enemy hitboxes are, and it's very tightly constructed around being able to just fit through things and just get things out. And if you have this knowledge, you can get pretty reliable with it. What makes the game very replayable, as frustrating as it is that it has RNG that changes everything run to run, moment to moment, but it isn't so random in some cases, where if you have enough knowledge, you can't overcome it. The thing about Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection that I think gives it a bit of a bad reputation with certain players, and it is a little bit earned at times, is as much as it has this great natural difficulty with limitation of the player and reactable RNG, it also does have some genuine bullshit that I think needs to be removed. And so, in terms of this review, it is good to draw the contrast between good natural difficulty and random bullshit. So good natural difficulty is stuff like limitations on what the player can do, or variations in enemy spawns. These types of things are something you can account for and learn over time with game knowledge. The things about this game that are bullshit is stuff like every so often you open a chest and a freaking magician pops out and turns you into a frog. And that's just based purely on chance. This is not the type of RNG that you want, especially with a game this intensive. That's really not necessary. That's the type of artificial difficulty we don't want.
What the fuck was that? What?
Another form of artificial difficulty in this game is the weapon selection and the weapon drops. So it turns out if you upgrade fully and you go through and collect all the fairies and upgrade fully, there is a perk where you can collect multiple weapons. That is good, but that perk should be by default. That should be at the very start of the game, because there is a lot of random bullshit in this game where a lot of the weapon types just suck. Like, you want the dagger and the crossbow at times, and maybe the lance, but then there's other weapons like the freaking hammer or whatever. All these other weapons that aren't very good, especially in particular situations. And what can often happen is the RNG of the item drops, where you're in a very fixed position and you kill something and then it drops a freaking flaming potion item on you and there's nothing you can do about it, and then you have to just redo the RNG till you get a proper weapon. That type of RNG where it's based off of chance and you need to sit and farm for the correct weapon, that's not what we want.
Oh wait, I forgot about this. Are you kidding me, game? Okay, I'm gonna sit this one out. There's no way I'm picking the joke. Are they serious? It's not gonna disappear. Don't tell me it's not gonna disappear. No way, this torch is just not gonna go away. I'm gonna have to try to jump over it. That chest was the greatest. Yep, of course. Of course.
Another form of artificial difficulty that I am not a fan of in this game are the hidden treasure chests. I call this artificial difficulty because there's not a real choice of whether or not you want the treasure chests. You want the treasure chests. That is a choice that you want. They definitely change how the game is played, and they definitely change the difficulty curve. You want these hidden treasure chests. You just have to go out of your way, go through guides, and learn their locations. Because what is gained in this process, other than you having to do homework, it doesn't change the risk reward. It doesn't change the decision making. It's just giving you the homework of knowing where the chests are. So this type of thing, if I were to adjust, just make the chests visible or give them glowing sparks or something so we know where they are. because this doesn't add anything to the game in the long run, and the focus of Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection is getting to the levels and traversing them, not hunting for secrets. So this is the type of difficulty I'm not a fan of, and Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection is interesting because it is a blend between the two. And this is where a lot of confusion can happen when discussing the difficulty of this game, because it has a lot of really good natural difficulty based around player limitation and spacing and enemy design. But then it has these little dashes of complete bullshit difficulty of like randomly appearing magicians or hidden treasure chests or item spawns, where even if you sometimes try to avoid the item, it can just drop in a location that is unavoidable. Or even worse, sometimes you will avoid the item but get killed and your bones will collect it. And again, it has a system that allows you to get around this crap with the upgradable select, but I think that should be unlocked right away. And another issue of this game that I haven't heard people discuss is the aspect ratio of Resurrection, where the older Ghost and Goblin games were in 4:3, but in Resurrection it is 16:9. The reason why this is an issue is not only does this have extra screen real estate that you have to be constantly assessing and keeping account of, especially if you have like red devils on the other side of the screen and they're just chasing you and you can't get away from them, but also with the shot limit of the game. So the fact that this game has a sword or dagger shot limit where you can only have so many weapons on screen before you can fire them more, like Mega Man, I think that is a really cool aspect of this game's design in concept, and it works in most scenarios, and it gives it a more point blanky, methodical, old school feel than you would something like Metal Slug, even though I prefer Metal Slug. That is really cool, but the problem is when you stretch out the game's screen real estate to 16:9, but then don't account for it with the shot limit, or don't account for it with the weapon speed or sprite size, or you don't account for that extra screen real estate. What that means is that if you throw a dagger or throw a lance and it misses, now that is extra punishing because that weapon like lingers on screen forever. That was something they should have addressed, and that is kind of bullshit. And that can be something that I think is legitimately frustrating, and why the 4:3 aspect ratio works much better for this game. And they could have offset this in some ways by just making the sprites bigger, or making things travel faster off screen, or maybe not doing such a wide aspect ratio. But I just wanted to point this out because this is another example of how retro style games need to be careful of how to approach a wider aspect ratio, because extra screen space in something like an FPS, maybe that's just extra vision and you can see a little bit better. But in an arcade style game where the walls and screen real estate are key to the level design, that needs to be accounted for. Otherwise you can run into random crap like this, like having such a weird feeling to the shot limit. Then on top of that, you have this character progression RPG system of getting the fairies and unlocking skills. I understand this is an aspect of modern game design that Capcom probably feel they can't avoid for replayability or whatever, but in my opinion, I don't think it works very well, like it doesn't work well for a lot of character action style games, because the question becomes, what is the fundamental mode or challenge of the game? Is it off of a brand new fresh save file, and in fact part of the game system is getting these upgrades as you go? That does seem to be the case with Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection players. Or is it the New Game Plus thing where you have everything unlocked, then you go back through the New Game Plus, especially like in the second loop? This is unclear. It's for the players to decide. I know most players start off of fresh save files, but who's to say the level design was not actually intended to have fully upgraded stuff from the very beginning? This is a problem we see across modern action games all the time, especially because this game is so faithful to the arcade style and older retro style. It needs like an official arcade mode that locks in these upgrades and like either has them happen statically as you go through, or formalize how the system is supposed to occur in a 1cc run. And speaking of 1cc's, another thing about not having an arcade mode for the game is that it makes the burden on the players looking for skilled choices really, really tricky, because the only metric this game has is total amounts of death, which means if you're going for a high skill run of the game, basically have to play for no death. And I'm not quite sure if the game was designed around this concept, especially with how much RNG it has, on top of like good healthy RNG. And so a friend of this channel, Boghog, is a huge Ghost and Goblins Resurrection fan. And I had many streams where I sat and watched him go for the no-death run of the game. And from time to time, he'd run into just complete...
This is madness!
That would end his no-death run, and it seemed like a little bit like torture.
Yeah, no way to reach from here. What was I supposed to do? What the f*** was I meant to do there? Yep, there's nothing I could do there, I don't think. Yeah, and I don't know, it's a... Dude, this again, this how do I fucking dodge it? Help! Help! Dude, this again, this pattern, how do I fucking dodge it? Come on. Gold armor, don't lose it. Come on, a bit more. A tiny bit more. Yes! Oh, yes! Holy shit. Okay. Damn. With a whole 11 days to spare. 11 days, and I got it. Oh, thanks a lot. Holy shit. Okay. I was really nervous there. Holy. Nice. Okay. Oh, that's a GNG defeated. GNG annihilated. Hell yeah.
Where if it had an arcade mode that formalized, okay, you actually have 3 extends to go for the 1cc, or 2, or 5, or whatever that metric would be, and you can gain extends by doing this. I think that would go a long ways towards giving the game more longevity in terms of challenge runs, because as it stands now, just no death. And sure, you can say, oh, I'm going for like a 3-death challenge run or a 5-death challenge run, but that doesn't feel as good or as legitimate as the game telling you this is what I want in an arcade mode. So that's another thing I find a little bit disappointing. In the scoring system, we won't even talk about that since it's fundamentally broken anyway. It has no real meaning. They're just numbers and they look cute. But that's not that uncommon for console-era action platformers, so I won't hold it against Resurrection too much. And of course, a proper practice mode with checkpoints for a game this dense and this intense, especially on Legendary difficulty, would be very much welcomed, because if you want to practice certain sections in Legendary mode, you have to go off these massive checkpoints that, watching Boghog stream, seem extremely frustrating. And you do get more checkpoints in the Night mode, but these checkpoints are at lower difficulty, so it doesn't fully translate over to Legendary mode. So they should have either added in a proper practice mode or had like a mode in between Night and Legendary where it has the Legendary amount of difficulty but the Night amount of checkpoints. That could have also been a solution. But overall, Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection is a rare example of a throwback revival of the series that not only does not compromise on the original vision and limitations of the player mechanics and difficulty and that type of thing, but also even pushes it further and even to a higher extreme. That is something that is incredibly rare to see these days, and I'd love to see happen with more franchises, because the way it is right now is whenever people talk about, oh, they're bringing Metroid back, or oh, they're bringing this franchise back, I always kind of roll my eyes because I know it's going to be dumbed down, easy, lame, modernized. Whereas Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection is unflinching and unashamed, and I respect that a lot. I'm not a huge fan of the game's music or the game's visuals. I get what it's going for with the whole storybook style, and from what I understand, the developer always wanted this storybook sort of aesthetic, but I think the way the aesthetic is actually accomplished, at least in most sections of the game, looks a little cheap and it looks a little underdeveloped, especially by Capcom standards. And what I think happened, this is my theory, is that Capcom knew this game was not going to be popular because of how brutal and cruel it is. and it's not going to catch on and get a lot of sales. So they're like, sure, buddy, because we respect you, you can make your crazy ass sequel and beat the crap out of new players and out of streamers all around the world. But we can't give you a huge budget to do so. But still, the fact that this game exists and plays so well is probably something we'd only see from a Japanese company. So shout outs to Capcom for at least making it happen. And it is a recommendation from me. This game is brutal and nasty, but in the proper ways for the most part. Though I do recommend, before you start playing, going through and watching other people's runs. And there's this great STG Weekly episode on it that gives you advice on how to start out, which I found immensely helpful. So shout outs to STG Weekly and their awesome game replay episode for giving me guidance on what to do. And also shout outs to Boghog for sponsoring this video, because he was the one who bought me a copy of Resurrection over a year ago with the hopes that I would play it and just enjoy it as much as he did. And of course, it took me over a year to fire it up, and it took the Patreons telling me, hey, you need to review this game. This is a Patreon voted review for it to happen, but it did, and I'm very glad that it did. And so I hope you all enjoyed this review and discussion of controls and difficulty, because I think these are fundamental concepts that need to be understood more widely. So please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Auto-Named, Bean Pit, Bo, Ben, Vito Dames, Boghog, Borky22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Climby Coyote, Coast, Coconut Crab, Color Boy, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Krusty Boy, Des Audio, Dan Chi, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dick Jones, Dingo, Disco Staslaya, DJ420, Praise It, Dr. Bosky, Elias Alonso, Evan Serafet, Fabra, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Peace Machine, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, House, Jake Ryan, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JB RPG, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, K-Horse, K2, Contain, Praise the Boys, Last of 7, Low Casting, Mieshpa, Blaze, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Googles, Ospi, Pedro Perez, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Ralph Trujillo, Raul VP, Real Skeen, Ren Haltz Time, Retro Schmupper, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Scanline City, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Spiders STG, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Toho Rizardi, Sugumo, 2YU, Twilight EX, Unicoi Roots, Ursula, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, Zachary Patton, and Zeal.